Hi, I'm Scott Travers. I'm going to show you a very basic freshwater fly that we're going to tie today. This fly is called the woolly bugger. It's a very common freshwater fly that's used. It's very successful in the Northeast where I usually fish. It can be tied in a variety of colors. It can be tied in black. It can be tied in a green or olive pattern. And what we're going to tie it in today is a tan or kind of golden pattern. And that's what we're going to be using today. For the hook size that you're going to use, you'll need a streamer hook, something in 2x length. Anywhere between a 6 and a 12 would probably be sufficient for you. Today I'm using a 2x size 10 lightning strike hook for this fly. One of the first things we want to do before we secure the hook in the vise is crimp down the barb on the hook. So I'm going to crimp that down using my vise, using a slight bit of pressure. I'm going to crimp that barb down. Once I have that done, I'm going to use a bead head on this fly. I'm going to use a black nickel size 3/16 inch diameter bead for this fly. You can also use a cone head, which is shaped a little bit differently. Again, it's a cone head. And the reason why we're going to use that, especially for beginning fly tiers, is that one of the more common mistakes people make when they tie a fly is that they what's called crowd the eye of the fly. So by using this bead on the end of our hook, that's going to prevent that from happening. So there are always two holes on the bead. There's a smaller hole and a larger hole on the opposite side. We want to be careful to put the smaller hole on the hook first. Once we slide that towards the eye, then we can secure our hook in the vise. We secure the hook in the vise so that the shank of the hook, or the long part of the hook, is horizontal. When I do that, I want to make sure that the hook is inside the vise securely. Also want to make sure that the bead is forward. And I want us to be able to see the point of the hook because we'll be using that to reference while we're tying. The thread I'm using is a brown thread, which is going to work well with the color materials we're going to be working with today. So I apply the thread to the top of the hook and I wrap it, holding the tag end with my left hand, and I wrap back towards the bend of the hook. As I'm wrapping, I'm putting these threads on the shank of the hook, over the hook and away from me. Now we have to be very careful once we get towards the point of the hook because we don't want to nick the thread with the point of the hook and cut the thread by accident. So once I get to that point, you see I take more of an oval set of turns on the shank of the hook as I continue working my way back towards the bend in the hook. Once I get to the bend, I'm going to let my thread hang down. I still have what's called the tag end of the thread left over. I'm going to trim that now. Once that's trimmed, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to affix the tail to the fly. I'm using this rusty brown Marabou for my tail today. Once I select my section of Marabou, I want to keep in mind for proportions for this fly, I want my tail to be approximately the same length as the shank of the hook. So once I pinch off a section, there's approximately the length of the hook. Right about there. I'm now going to apply that to the back of the hook so that it hangs off about a hook's or a shank's length behind it. Again, using those oval wraps, I'm going to secure that to the top of the hook with 3 or 4 wraps of thread. Now I'll take the remainder of that Marabou and I'm going to trim that just behind the bead head. Now I can remove the rest of that. Some people will apply a layer of wire to the hook before they use the thread. And for that, people will generally use lead wire or a lead wire substitute. Lead is obviously bad for the environment, so we try not to do that anymore. If you do have other wire, non-lead wire, you can apply that before the thread. But using that big tungsten bead, we're not going to need that extra weight today. So again, I'm just going to wrap these materials around the shank, coming forward, and then I'm going to wrap back to that initial tie-in point. All this is doing is securing that material, strengthening that tie-in to the hook, and giving that body a little thickness. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tie in some crystal flash in the tail section. Again, I've picked a selection for this crystal flash that matches the color of the fly that we're tying. You can see that this tone of crystal flash might work better for the green color if we were using that, or the olive. And again, this kind of shinier more silver tone might work with the black if we were tying a black woolly bugger today. So I'll take one section of this from the package. Now I fold it in half in my hands, and once I get it in equal sections, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut that in half. Now that I've cut that in half, I'm going to take those two sections and fold them in half in my fingers. I'm going to come forward a little bit on the hook to just in front of the point, because I want to be able to direct this crystal flash back over the tail. Now that I've wrapped that around the thread, very simply, like this, I'm going to hold all four parts, my left hand, and I'm just going to make sure that I secure those to the top of the shank of the hook. I secure that with 3 wraps. Then I make sure I take 2 for one side, 2 for the other side. I hold them alongside the tail, and I wrap back a couple more times. That way I secure them in that horizontal position. And now I'm back in at the tie-in point, and I have those facing back. Now what I can do is I can just take that excess crystal flash and trim it about as far as that tail goes. Remember, I don't want to trim any parts of the tail off. I just want to trim that crystal flash to meet that tail length. Now that that's completed, I'm going to take a section of chenille. Approximately a 4-inch section should suffice for this. I'm going to set that aside. And also I'll need some hackle. I will select that hackle so that the fibers of the hackle are approximately the width of the hook gap, which is this section here between the shank and the point. Make a rough estimation on that. And I take my feather out. So, since the hackle is the last thing that I'm going to wrap forward, I'll tie that in first. I'm going to affix that to the side of the hook closest to me. I'm going to do it so that the very tip of the feather is about 3/4 of the way towards that bead head. Again, I'm going to wrap that and secure that in with several wraps. Okay, now that that's secured, that feather's just going to hang off the back for now. Now I'm going to wrap the chenille in. I'm going to secure that chenille. Same thing, I'm going to apply that to the side of the hook closest to me. I'm going to secure it so that I can get a few good turns of thread on that. And I'm going to bring my thread forward now to just behind the bead head. Now what you can use is a set of hackle pliers. I have 2 different types here today. I have this type and this type. I prefer to work with this type of hackle plier. Just showing you different options. If I was to not use a hackle plier and wrap with my hands, I'm going to wrap with this brown chenille forward with touching wraps. That means each successive wrap touches each other. And I'm going to wrap forward, and I'm going to bring that to just behind that bead head. You can see as I'm getting closer how it can be a little more difficult to hold on to, which is why those hackle pliers are so helpful. Now holding this at a 90 degree like this, I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to bring it through that 90 degree angle. I'm going to bring it through once, twice, and 3 times to secure that chenille in behind the bead head. Now we can let it go, it's secured, and I can trim off the excess. Now that I've trimmed that excess off, I can wrap my hackle forward over it. Now what I can do with this hackle, which I prefer to do, is kind of stroke the fibers back to open them up. So now that I've got those open, I'll choose to use the hackle pliers at this point, and I'll apply them to the feather here. So using my hackle pliers, I'm going to wrap that thread. I'm going to be using open wraps this time. And as I come forward, you're going to see how those fibers on that feather open up, and they give this thing a really fantastic buggy look. So again, I'm coming to just behind that bead head. Now that I'm there, again, I have that 90 degree angle that we talked about before. And same thing, I'm going to bring that thread just behind the bead head and secure that hackle in with 3 wraps just behind that bead head. Now that that's secure, I can let go with my hackle pliers, and I can trim the remainder of this hackle feather off. It's important to not come in with the jaws of the scissors open too wide, then we come in and we trim a lot of those fibers. So I'm just going to come in with it open just a little bit and trim off just the very end of that. Now that that's secure, what I can do is I could choose to whip finish this, which is a certain type of knot and a way to tie off the thread, but it's fairly complicated for a beginner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use successive wraps with a locking hitch. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the thread over itself like this. I'm going to lock that in just behind the bead head. That way it secures everything right here and it locks it in place. I'm going to do that 3 times. So I did it once, I'm going to do it twice, and I'm going to do it a 3rd time just to make sure we get that good and locked in place. Make sure those materials aren't going to go anywhere. Now that I have that locked in, I can trim my excess thread and remove our fly from the vise, and there we have it. There's our woolly bugger.